Welcome back to Military History Hub. After the Battle of Midway, the Pacific War entered a new phase. For the first time, the United States went on the offensive against Japan. This is the story of the Guadalcanal Campaign, a brutal struggle on land, sea, and air that changed the direction of the war in the Pacific. Guadalcanal is a small island in the Solomon Islands, located in the South Pacific. At first glance, it appeared insignificant. However, in 1942, its location made it strategically critical. Japan began building an airfield on Guadalcanal to threaten Allied supply routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. If completed, this airfield would allow Japan to control large areas of the South Pacific and isolate Australia from American support. After the victory at Midway, the United States saw a chance to strike back. American leaders wanted to stop Japan's expansion and force the Japanese military onto the defensive. Guadalcanal became the target for this first major offensive operation by U.S. forces in the Pacific. The plan was risky. American forces were still rebuilding after Pearl Harbor, and they lacked experience in large-scale amphibious operations. However, delaying action would only strengthen Japanese positions in the region. In August 1942, U.S. Marines were selected to land on Guadalcanal and capture the airfield under construction. The goal was simple: take the airfield, deny it to Japan, and use it to protect Allied supply lines. What followed was not a quick operation. Instead, Guadalcanal turned into a long and brutal campaign that lasted months. Fighting took place on land, at sea, and in the air. Control of the island changed hands repeatedly, and both sides suffered heavy losses. Guadalcanal would become a test of endurance, logistics, and strategy. It was a battle where victory depended not just on firepower, but on survival itself. On August 7, 1942, American forces launched their first major offensive in the Pacific War. U.S. Marines landed on the beaches of Guadalcanal, as well as nearby islands, in a large amphibious operation. The landing surprised Japanese forces. Japan did not expect the United States to attack so quickly after Midway, and defenses on Guadalcanal were limited. Most Japanese troops were focused on completing the airfield and were not prepared for a full-scale invasion. The initial landings faced relatively light resistance. U.S. Marines secured the beaches and moved inland toward the unfinished airfield. Within a short time, American forces captured the airfield almost intact. This became one of the most important moments of the campaign. The captured airfield was later named Henderson Field. Control of this airfield would determine the outcome of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Whoever controlled Henderson Field could dominate the skies above the island and surrounding waters. Although the Marines achieved early success, problems quickly appeared. Supplies were limited, and Japanese naval forces controlled much of the surrounding sea. American transport ships were forced to withdraw earlier than planned due to the threat of Japanese attacks. This left many Marines on the island with limited food, ammunition, and equipment. Japan reacted quickly. Once Japanese commanders realized that Guadalcanal was under attack, they began sending reinforcements by sea. Because American air power now operated from Henderson Field during the day, Japanese ships began using nighttime supply runs. These missions became known as the Tokyo Express. While the Americans held the airfield during the day, Japan controlled much of the surrounding area at night. This created a constant cycle of attacks, reinforcements, and counterattacks. Guadalcanal became a battle where neither side held full control. On land, the Marines began preparing defensive positions around Henderson Field. Japanese ground forces launched repeated attacks in an effort to retake the airfield. These assaults were often poorly coordinated but determined. Fighting took place in dense jungle, under extreme heat, disease, and exhaustion. As weeks passed, both sides realized that Guadalcanal was not a secondary fight. It had become a critical battle that demanded more troops, more ships, and more resources. Control of the island would affect the entire Pacific War. The campaign had only just begun. As the campaign continued, Guadalcanal turned into one of the harshest battlefields of the Pacific War. Fighting on the island was not only against the enemy, but also against the environment. American Marines faced extreme conditions. The tropical climate brought constant heat, heavy rain, and thick jungle. Malaria, dysentery, and other diseases spread quickly. Food was limited and many soldiers suffered from hunger and exhaustion. Medical supplies were often scarce. Despite these conditions, Japanese forces launched repeated attacks to retake Henderson Field. Japanese commanders believed that aggressive night assaults could break American defenses. These attacks were intense and deadly, often happening in darkness with little visibility. One of the most important ground battles occurred along the perimeter protecting Henderson Field. Japanese troops attacked in large waves, sometimes charging directly into American machine gun fire. These assaults resulted in heavy Japanese casualties, but showed their determination to reclaim the airfield. American forces relied on defensive positions, coordinated firepower, and artillery support. Over time, U.S. troops gained experience in jungle warfare. They learned how to strengthen their defenses and improve communication under difficult conditions. Both sides suffered greatly. Soldiers spent long periods without rest. Bodies remained on the battlefield due to constant fighting. Supplies had to be carried by hand through dense jungle terrain, slowing every movement. Control of the airfield remained the key objective. As long as the Americans held Henderson Field, they could bring in aircraft to support ground troops and attack Japanese supply routes. This forced Japan to continue risky nighttime missions to deliver reinforcements and supplies. Morale became a major factor. For American troops, Guadalcanal was a test of endurance. Many had never experienced combat before. For Japanese forces, the campaign challenged their belief in quick victories and offensive attacks. As weeks passed, it became clear that this was no longer a short operation. Guadalcanal was turning into a long struggle, where survival often mattered as much as strategy. Neither side was willing to give up. Meanwhile, the fighting on land was only part of the battle. At sea, one of the most dangerous naval struggles of the war was about to unfold. While ground fighting continued on Guadalcanal, the struggle at sea became just as important. Control of the waters around the island determined whether troops could receive supplies, reinforcements, and support. Japan still had strong naval forces in the region and used them aggressively. Because American aircraft controlled the skies during the day from Henderson Field, Japanese ships operated mainly at night. These nighttime missions allowed Japanese destroyers and cruisers to deliver troops, ammunition, and food under cover of darkness. The sea battles around Guadalcanal were chaotic and extremely dangerous. Many engagements took place at night, at close range, with limited visibility. Both sides relied on flares, searchlights, and radar, but confusion was common. Ships often fired at short distances, and battles could be decided within minutes. One of the most important naval engagements was the Battle of Savo Island. In this battle, Japanese warships surprised Allied naval forces guarding the transports near Guadalcanal. Several Allied cruisers were sunk, and the loss shocked American commanders. It showed that Japan still had a powerful and experienced navy. Despite this setback, the United States continued to push supplies toward Guadalcanal. Each trip was risky. Japanese submarines, aircraft, and surface ships threatened American convoys constantly. Some American ships were sunk before they could unload completely. As the campaign continued, more naval battles followed. These included clashes that lasted through the night and into daylight hours. In several cases, ships on both sides were damaged or sunk in the same engagement. The waters around Guadalcanal became filled with wrecks, oil slicks, and debris. The constant naval fighting drained both fleets. Crews were exhausted, ships were damaged, and losses mounted. However, American industrial strength allowed damaged ships to be repaired and replaced more quickly than Japanese losses. Naval battles around Guadalcanal were often fought with limited information. Commanders had to make decisions under pressure, sometimes relying on incomplete or incorrect reports. Mistakes were common, and outcomes were often unpredictable. Despite heavy losses, the United States gradually began to improve its naval tactics. Radar technology became more effective, coordination between ships improved, and American commanders gained valuable combat experience. By late 1942, it became clear that Japan could no longer freely control the waters at night. American naval strength was growing, and Japanese supply missions became more difficult and costly. The fight for Guadalcanal was entering its final phase. By late 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal began to change. What started as a bold Japanese effort to retake the island slowly turned into a fight for survival. Japan was losing the battle of supply, and this began to affect every part of the campaign. Japanese troops arriving on Guadalcanal were often exhausted and undersupplied. Nighttime supply runs were becoming more dangerous due to American air and naval power. Many transport ships were sunk before reaching the island, forcing Japan to use destroyers that could carry only limited supplies. As a result, soldiers often arrived without enough food, ammunition, or medical equipment. On land, Japanese attacks continued but became less effective. American defenses around Henderson Field were stronger and better organized. U.S. troops had gained valuable combat experience and improved coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support. American aircraft operating from Henderson Field played a decisive role. They attacked Japanese ships during daylight hours, reducing Japan's ability to reinforce and resupply its forces. This air superiority placed growing pressure on Japanese commanders, who began to realize that holding Guadalcanal might no longer be possible. Major clashes occurred as Japan attempted one last effort to retake the airfield. These attacks resulted in heavy casualties and failed to break American control. At the same time, U.S. forces launched limited offensives on land, pushing Japanese units back into the jungle. Diseases, starvation, and lack of supplies began to weaken Japanese morale. Many troops were physically unable to fight. Conditions deteriorated rapidly, and Japanese leadership struggled to find solutions. At sea, the balance was also shifting. American naval forces became more effective at intercepting Japanese supply runs. Radar, improved tactics, and growing experience reduced Japan's ability to operate freely at night. Losses mounted on both sides, but Japan's losses were harder to replace. By December 1942, Japanese leadership reached a critical conclusion. Guadalcanal was no longer sustainable. Continuing the fight would only lead to further losses without strategic benefit. Quietly, Japan began planning a withdrawal. The campaign was approaching its final chapter. In early 1943, Japanese leaders made a critical decision. After months of heavy fighting, they concluded that holding Guadalcanal was no longer possible. Losses at sea, constant air attacks, and severe shortages of food and supplies had weakened Japanese forces beyond recovery. Rather than launching another costly offensive, Japan planned a secret evacuation. The operation was carried out with careful deception. Japanese forces continued limited attacks to hide their true intention, while preparations were made to remove troops from the island during night operations. In February 1943, Japanese destroyers successfully evacuated thousands of soldiers from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. American forces initially believed Japan was preparing for another attack, not a retreat. By the time the truth became clear, Japan had already removed most of its remaining forces. With the evacuation complete, the Guadalcanal Campaign came to an end. The island was now firmly in American hands. This victory marked the first successful large-scale land operation by the United States against Japan during World War II. The impact of Guadalcanal was far-reaching. It forced Japan onto the defensive for the remainder of the war. Japanese expansion had stopped, and the initiative had shifted to the Allies. From this point forward, Japan would struggle to regain momentum. Guadalcanal also reshaped American military planning. The campaign demonstrated the importance of airfields, naval cooperation, and sustained logistics. Lessons learned on Guadalcanal were applied to future operations across the Pacific, including island-hopping campaigns that slowly pushed toward Japan. For American troops, Guadalcanal was a harsh but vital lesson. It tested leadership, endurance, and coordination under some of the most difficult conditions of the war. Success was not immediate or easy, but it proved that the United States could defeat Japan in prolonged combat. Historians often describe Guadalcanal as the battle that truly turned the tide in the Pacific after Midway. While Midway stopped Japan's expansion at sea, Guadalcanal marked the moment when Allied forces began pushing back on land. The campaign also revealed the limits of Japanese strategy. Their reliance on aggressive attacks and nighttime operations could not overcome the growing strength of American industry, logistics, and coordination. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the direction of the Pacific War was clear. The Allies were moving forward, and Japan was falling back. The long road toward victory had begun. Guadalcanal was not just a battle for an island. It was a battle for control of the Pacific, and it changed the course of World War II forever.